May 8, 1945. 2:34 p.m. A converted schoolhouse outside Aurich, East Frisia. The door opened inward, slowly, as if whoever stood on the other side was giving them time to prepare. 37 women pressed against the far wall of what had been a classroom, their shadows long in the afternoon light filtering through windows someone had tried to board up but hadn't quite finished. Boots on the threshold. Not marching. Walking. A silhouette against the brightness, then a voice, calm, accented, careful. Canadian Army. We're here to process civilians. No one will be harmed. The women had been waiting 3 days. 3 days of silence broken only by distant engines, sporadic gunfire, the sounds of a war ending in pieces. They'd expected shouting when the door finally opened. Orders barked in hard English. Perhaps worse. The propaganda had been explicit, designed to prevent surrender, to make capture seem worse than death. Instead, the soldier removed his helmet, held it under one arm, and said in slow, deliberate German, "My name is Corporal MacLeod. We have water. And food. Please come outside when you're ready. Please." One woman, Anna, a telephone operator from Emden, would write weeks later, "I had braced for violence. I was not prepared for politeness. Somehow that undid me more than fear ever had. They expected wolves. They met Canadians. And the difference changed everything." The moment unfolds the way all transformations do, with contradiction so stark it paralyzes thought. May 1945. The Canadian First Army had swept through the Netherlands and into northwestern Germany, their advance marked by the systematic collapse of what remained of German resistance. By the time they reached East Frisia, there were no battles left, just the messy aftermath of occupation, the logistical nightmare of processing thousands of displaced persons, refugees, surrendered soldiers, and the women auxiliaries who'd kept the Wehrmacht's administrative machinery functioning until there was no machinery left to keep. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries. The Stabshelferinnen, administrative staff. Women who decoded messages, managed supply chains, operated communications equipment. They'd worn uniforms, lived in barracks, followed orders. But when the orders stopped, they were simply women, stranded between a collapsing regime and an uncertain future. The Canadian military government units found them in schools, bunkers, farmhouses, basements. Sometimes they surrendered. Sometimes they were simply there when the soldiers arrived. Most expected the worst. Their own propaganda had seen to that, filling their heads with lurid stories of what Allied soldiers did to German women. What they found instead were men from Saskatchewan and Ontario, from Nova Scotia and Manitoba, who'd been told to process them, document them, and treat them according to regulations that specified humane detention. Not mercy exactly. But not vengeance either. The gap between expectation and reality was a chasm. And crossing it required recalibrating everything they thought they knew about enemies, about war, about themselves. The processing station was organized with a precision that felt surreal. Tables arranged in rows beneath spring sunlight streaming through tall schoolhouse windows. Canadian soldiers typing on portable typewriters, the clicking rhythm oddly soothing. A medical station set up in what had been the teacher's office, marked with a red cross painted on canvas so clean it looked out of place in a world caked in rubble and ash. The women formed a line without being told. Old habits. They'd spent years lining up, for rations, for assignments, for inspections. This was just another line. Except the man at the front desk wasn't German. Corporal MacLeod worked methodically. Name. Last posting. Any medical conditions. He filled out forms in triplicate carbon paper leaving ghost impressions. When a woman couldn't remember her exact assignment date, he simply wrote, approximate, May 1944, and moved on. No anger. No impatience. Next, he said. Always the same tone. Professional. Neutral. Almost gentle. When Anna reached the desk, her hands shook so badly she dropped her identification papers. MacLeod picked them up, set them carefully on the desk between them, and waited while she steadied herself. Telephone operator? He asked in German, reading from her card. She nodded. Where? Emden. The post office. Until March. He made a note. Then looked up. The post office is gone. Bombed February 6th. Ref. You weren't there? I was reassigned. To the signal station in Aurich. And now you're here. Yes. He stamped a form. Handed her a slip of paper with a number on it. Take this to the medical station. Then to the mess area. There's soup. She stared at the paper. At the number that had replaced her name. But the number meant something. It meant documentation, organization, the possibility of being found later, of existing in some official record. It meant she hadn't simply disappeared into chaos. "Thank you," she said, surprising herself. McLeod nodded. Next. The soup arrived in steel cauldrons carried by Canadian mess personnel who moved with the weary efficiency of men who'd served thousands of meals in dozens of locations across a continent at war. The smell hit first: potatoes, onions, something that might have been chicken. Real food. Not sawdust-stretched bread or the thin gruel they'd been rationing among themselves for days. Actual soup, thick enough that the ladle stood upright. The women hesitated at the serving line. Was this a test? A trick? One of them, Liesel, barely 20, a clerk from Lear, reached out for a bowl with trembling hands. The cook, a sergeant with a French-Canadian accent, filled it without looking at her face. Professional distance. But not cruel distance. Just the practiced neutrality of someone serving meals to people whose names he didn't need to know. "Bread?" he asked. She nodded. He added a thick slice, real wheat bread, darker than anything she'd seen in months. She carried the bowl to a bench outside and sat. Around her, other women did the same, sitting in the May sunshine holding bowls of hot soup, trying to reconcile the food in their hands with the fear in their hearts. Liesel ate slowly. Each spoonful deliberate, savored. Halfway through, tears started running down her face, silent and unexpected. She didn't sob. Didn't make noise. Just cried while she ate, salt from tears mixing with salt from soup. A Canadian private, young, maybe 19, walked past, saw her crying and stopped. For a moment she thought he'd take the soup away. Punishment for weakness, for showing emotion. Instead he reached into his pocket and held out a handkerchief. Clean. Pressed. White. "It's all right," he said in broken German. "You can keep it." "He gave me his handkerchief," Liesel wrote later. "Such a small thing. But it was the first time in years anyone had acknowledged that I was still human enough to need one. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The internment facility at Auric had been a Wehrmacht barracks until 3 weeks earlier. Now it held 1,500 women in a compound of wooden buildings surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers manned by Canadian soldiers who looked impossibly young and impossibly tired. The convoy of trucks arrived at dusk, their headlights cutting through the mist rising from the coastal plain. Women climbed down, clutching their belongings. Pillowcases stuffed with clothes, cardboard boxes tied with string, cloth bundles that held everything they'd managed to keep through the collapse. A captain stood at the gate. Captain Morrison, they would learn later, a lawyer from Toronto who spoke German with a textbook precision that made him sound formal even when he was trying to be reassuring. He addressed them in formation, his voice carrying across the yard. "You are classified as civilian internees pending final documentation. You will be housed, fed, and provided medical care. There are regulations. They will be posted. This is not a prison. It is a holding facility. Cooperate and you will be treated fairly." Treated fairly. The phrase hung in the air like something fragile and unlikely. But the barracks were clean. Swept. The bunks had thin mattresses and wool blankets marked with broad arrows, Canadian military issue. There were stoves, unlit but stocked with coal. Latrines that had been recently dug and properly maintained. Buckets for washing. A mess hall that still smelled of disinfectant and effort. Order. After months of chaos, order. The first night, no one slept. They lay in the dark, listening. To each other's breathing. To the guards outside, their boots crunching gravel on regular patrols. To the distant sound of engines, of a world still moving even though their war had stopped. Someone began humming. Just a melody, no words. A folk song about spring and rivers, about things that existed before the war and might exist after. Others joined, quietly, tentatively. Not all of them. But enough that the sound became something shared, a collective exhalation. When dawn came gray and cold through the windows, they discovered routine. Roll call at 7. But not the harsh parade ground formations they'd known. Just names called from a list, responses given, a count conducted by Sergeant Mitchell, a farmer from Alberta who held his clipboard like it was something sacred and never raised his voice above conversational level. Present, they said. One by one. An acknowledgement of survival. Breakfast at 8. Porridge. Bread with margarine. Not abundant but regular. The predictability of it, knowing there would be breakfast tomorrow and the day after, was almost as nourishing as the food itself. Work details posted on a board, kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, minor repairs. The work was real but not punitive. No one was beaten for working slowly. No one collapsed from exhaustion. It was simply work, the kind that maintained the basic functions of a community. Between the structure, between the meals and the routines there was time. Time to sit. To write letters that might never be delivered. To remember, though remembering hurt like a physical wound. The kindnesses accumulated slowly, almost invisibly. A guard who noticed a woman shivering during evening roll call and returned 15 minutes later with an extra blanket. Not his own. He'd gone to the supply depot, filled out a requisition form, made it official. A medic who treated an infected blister with the same care he'd give anyone, explaining in patient German what the sulfa powder would do, how to keep it dry, when to return if it didn't improve. A cook who, seeing how the women stared at the margarine as if it were gold, began adding small amounts of real butter when supplies allowed. Not much. Just enough that occasionally the bread tasted like something from before the war. These were not grand gestures. They were not mercy in the abstract sense. They were the tiny grinding gears of decency maintained under pressure. The choice, repeated daily, to treat people as people even when history said you didn't have to. Greta had been a radio operator at a coastal station, listening to Allied frequencies and logging call signs. She was 23, efficient, a believer in systems and order. The war had made sense to her in a way it hadn't to others. Clear rules, defined hierarchies, a structure you could trust. The camp dismantled that trust piece by piece. Not through cruelty. Through consistency. The guards rotated on schedule. Meals arrived on time. The rules, posted in German and English on every barracks wall, were enforced fairly. When a Canadian private was caught stealing cigarettes from the supply depot, he was arrested, court-martialed, and sentenced. Publicly. In front of the internees. Greta watched it happen. Watched discipline applied to the victors, not just the vanquished. Watched justice function even in occupation. It broke something in her. Or fixed something. She wasn't sure which. She began attending the English classes organized by a former schoolteacher from Hamburg. Started helping in the administrative office, translating documents. Found herself working alongside Corporal Davies, a clerk from Montreal who typed with 2 fingers and whistled off-key while he worked. One afternoon, Davies set down a requisition form and asked, "Did you believe it? What they told you about us?" Greta looked up. "Some of it." "Which parts?" "That you would be angry." Davies nodded slowly. "We are. But not at you." That distinction, small, semantic, enormous, changed everything. "He separated me from my government," Greta wrote. "I had never imagined that was possible." Irmgard had been a supervisor in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, managing a labor company that built tank traps and fortifications. She was 32, competent, a woman who'd risen through ranks by being more organized than everyone around her. She believed in duty, in service, in the righteousness of following orders. The camp eroded that certainty gradually. First, when she saw how the Canadians treated the refugees, Polish forced laborers, Dutch civilians, German Jews who'd somehow survived. No hierarchy of suffering. Just people who needed food, shelter, documentation. Second, when the Red Cross arrived and distributed parcels. Soap, toothbrushes, writing paper, chocolate. The guards didn't steal from the supplies. Didn't demand bribes for access. Just distributed them according to manifests, efficiently, fairly, as if fairness still meant something. Third, when she overheard 2 guards talking near the barracks. One showed a photograph, a daughter maybe 3 years old, blonde pigtails, laughing. The other showed his own photo, a fiancé in a summer dress. They looked at those photographs the way Irmgard had seen her own husband look at pictures of their son before Stalingrad took him. The enemy had children. Had families. Had vulnerabilities and hopes and fears that looked exactly like hers. The realization was vertigo. Everything she'd been told, everything she'd believed, required the enemy to be less than human. But here they were, human in every particular detail. The ideological collapse happened in small moments, not grand revelations. Hilda, a logistics clerk from Wilhelmshaven, asked a Canadian corporal why he bothered being fair. Why not take revenge? Why not make them suffer the way Germany had made others suffer? The corporal, Thompson from a small town in New Brunswick, looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because then we'd be no better than what we fought," he said. "And I didn't come all this way to become that." It wasn't doctrine. Wasn't policy. Just one man's answer. But it was the first time anyone had suggested that decency could be a choice, not a weakness. "I had assumed kindness required naivety," Hilda wrote. "He showed me it required strength." Margaret had been a postal censor, reading letters from soldiers to their families, redacting anything that might compromise security. She'd read thousands of letters. Love letters, grief letters, letters trying to maintain normalcy across impossible distances. In the camp, she was assigned to the mail room helping sort letters for the internees. Most went unanswered, the addresses no longer existed, the recipients dead or scattered. But some came back. Responses from families in the Soviet zone, from relatives in the American sector, from children who'd been evacuated and were trying to find their mothers. She worked alongside a Canadian corporal named Wilson, a postal worker from Winnipeg in his civilian life. They sorted mail in companionable silence, two people who understood that letters were never just paper, they were lifelines, hope made tangible. One day Wilson handed her a letter. Her name on the envelope. From her sister in Hamburg. It came through the Red Cross system, he said. Took 6 weeks. Margaret held the envelope, afraid to open it. Afraid of what it might say or what it might not say. Take your time, Wilson said. Then quietly left the room, giving her privacy she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. He understood that some moments belong only to you, she wrote. That was mercy of a kind I had never known. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. June brought warmth and the first real sense that the war was over, not just paused. Someone organized a choir. A former music teacher from Bremen led practices twice a week in the mess hall, teaching harmonies to women who'd forgotten how to sing for pleasure rather than propaganda. They practiced folk songs, hymns, even O Canada, at the request of a guard who was homesick and wanted to hear it in German, however badly pronounced. The Canadians listened from outside, smoking cigarettes, not interfering. Once, Captain Morrison stopped during his evening rounds and stood at the door, listening. When they finished, he nodded, not applause, just acknowledgement, and continued his patrol. Music became a bridge when words failed. A shared language that didn't require translation or trust, just willingness to make sound together. Repatriation began in July. Lists were posted. Names called. Women assembled with their bundles, their meager possessions, their letters they hoped would somehow reach home. Trucks took them to transit camps, then to trains heading east into the Soviet zone or south into the British and American sectors. But not everyone left. Some had no homes to return to, cities erased by bombing, families lost in the chaos of collapse. Others stayed because the unknown beyond the wire seemed more dangerous than the known within it. By 1947, thousands of German women remained in Canada and Britain, many having emigrated, some having married Allied soldiers, others simply rebuilding lives in places that weren't home but were at least stable. Anna returned to Emden in August 1945 and found her street gone, replaced by rubble and silence. She lived with an aunt for 9 months, then found work as a translator for the Canadian occupation authorities. She emigrated to Toronto in 1949, married a veteran she'd met during processing, and raised 2 children who grew up bilingual and confused about which country to cheer for in hockey. In 1992, she returned to the schoolhouse in Auric for a memorial service. The building was a community center now. But she stood in the room where she'd waited 3 days in fear and told a journalist, "This is where I learned that the enemy could say please." That simple word saved my life in ways I didn't understand for years. Liesel never found her family. Her parents had died in the bombing of Leer. Her brother was listed as missing, presumed dead, somewhere in the Soviet Union. She grieved without closure, a grief that never fully resolved but eventually became something she could carry. She worked for a relief organization until 1950, then immigrated to Nova Scotia, where she taught German at a high school and kept a garden that reminded her of home. She never married. She sent Christmas cards to the private who'd given her the handkerchief until his death in 1994. Each card said the same thing: "Thank you for seeing me." Greta stayed in Germany, working for the Canadian military government until 1952, then for a trading company reopening business between Canada and Germany. She married a civilian contractor from Manitoba in 1955 and moved to Winnipeg, where she lived until her death in 2003. In her papers, her children found a letter she'd written but never sent, addressed to Corporal Davies. It read, "You asked if I believed what they told us. I did. I believed the Allies were monsters. You proved me wrong by being decent when you had every right not to be. I have spent my life trying to deserve that decency. Thank you for making it possible." Irmgard returned to her children in 1946, raised them in the ruins of what had been, and never spoke about the war except to say, when pressed, that it had taught her the difference between order and justice. She died in 1988. Her eulogy, written by her daughter, included a line from a letter found in her desk. "I learned that civilization is not what you build. It is what you choose to preserve when everything is falling apart." The story does not end with redemption because history doesn't trade in such currency. It ends with people who carried complicated truths for the rest of their lives. Truths about complicity and decency, about guilt and grace, about the terrible and necessary work of rebuilding a world from rubble. The women who passed through Auric and camps like it never forgot. Some spoke about it. Some buried it. Some built entire philosophies around those months, trying to understand how kindness could coexist with conquest, how the enemy could be decent when decency seemed impossible. But something shifted in those spaces. Not forgiveness, that was too large, too freighted with questions about who had the right to forgive what. But something smaller and more durable, the recognition that even in the aftermath of total war, even when hatred was justified and vengeance would have been understood, there were still men who chose to say please, when they could have simply ordered. That choice didn't erase what had been done, didn't balance the scales or wash away the blood. But it created space for what came next, for treaties and trade, for marriages and migrations, for a future that wasn't just endless repetition of the past. 70 years later, historians interview survivors for an oral history project. The recordings are archived, digitized, made available to students trying to understand a war that ended before their grandparents were born. In one interview, a former internee, Elka, who'd been 19 in 1945, says, "People ask me if I forgave them. But that's the wrong question. They didn't ask to be forgiven. They just did their jobs with decency. And that decency, that choice to be human when they could have been monsters, that's what I remember. Not the fear. Not the defeat. The moment when someone handed me soup and called me Miss." In another interview, a Canadian veteran, Private Edwards, who'd been 20 in 1945, says, "We'd been taught to hate. And I did. I hated what Germany had done, what the war had cost. But then you're standing there processing some girl who's crying because she hasn't heard from her family in months, and you realize, hate is easy. Decency is hard. And we chose the hard thing. I'm proud of that. More proud of that than anything else I did in that war." If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The door that opened slowly on that May afternoon, giving them time to prepare, time to breathe, echoed through decades. It was not a door of conquest. It was a door of arrival, of presence, of the quiet insistence that even in the wreckage of total war, even when vengeance would have been easy and mercy seemed absurd, there was still a choice. The choice was not to forget. Not to forgive easily or absolve what couldn't be absolved. But to refuse to let the war determine every action that followed. To treat people, even defeated people, even enemy people, as if they might someday need to live in the same world again. The women who heard that door open expected wolves. They found men. Imperfect men. Men who sometimes failed, sometimes fell short, sometimes made mistakes. But men who, more often than not, chose to remove their helmets when they could have kept them on. Who chose to say please, when they could have simply commanded. Who chose to serve soup when they could have withheld it. That was not redemption. But it was a beginning. The war had taught them fear. The peace, slow and painful and incomplete, taught them something harder. That decency was possible even when it wasn't required. That mercy could survive even total war. That the word please still carried weight, even spoken by soldiers in a foreign uniform standing in a doorway giving you time to prepare for whatever came next. They expected monsters. They met Canadians. And in that gap between expectation and reality, the future became possible again.